Hello, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 2, Introduction to Logic. Before we dive into the lecture itself, I wanted to take a few moments and just talk about why it is we spend any time at all talking about logic when we are in an ethics course. And I mentioned in a previous video, I believe, that I actually talk about logic not only in my ethics course, but in any of my intro courses, because I think it's that important, right? Logic. And so why is it that we're taking some time, in fact, an entire lecture, although it's a shorter lecture? Why is it that we're spending any time at all talking about logic? Well, because logic is, as we'll see on the, I believe, the first slide, right, of the lecture itself, it's the study of arguments. And, what is philosophy? But in a general sense, right, the speculation or debate, if you will, about, all these deep-seated issues, right, where people are going to try to convince us via arguments that their position or their take on all these issues is the proper one to subscribe to, right, or to take yourself. So arguments are everywhere. The point is, arguments are everywhere in philosophy, right, and logic is the study of arguments. So if we're going to be spending some time talking about philosophy and specifically ethics, right, one of the primary branches of philosophy, then it would behoove us, since philosophy entails many arguments, it would behoove us then to become at least somewhat familiar with the nature of arguments. What does an argument look like? How do we go about figuring out if it's any good? Right? How do we determine whether, for example, Immanuel Kant is convincing in his approach to ethics, right? And suggesting that deontology is the proper moral outlook. How do we figure that out? Well, logic is going to more or less, equip us with the tools we need. At least, all we're going to do is sort of the basic stuff, right? To equip us at least an elementary level to handle those arguments that we're going to be confronted with for the rest of the course. So that's the impetus for spending a little bit of time on logic. It's going to help us throughout the remainder of the course in terms of determining what we think, right, are the better arguments that we come across. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and dive in. And again, I will try to mention as I go through, right, I have a print off of the PowerPoint lecture, and I'll try to mention as I go through when I'm going to the next page, right, if you're following along on a PowerPoint, right, when to go to the next slide. So again, we're talking about logic. What is logic? It's basically the study of arguments, right, in order to determine whether they're any good, right? We want to know not only whether there's an argument here, right, but whether, ideally, the more important thing is whether it's any good. Okay, so whenever I teach logic, I always begin by pointing out I think it's best to approach it as if it entailed a two-step process. On the one hand, we're first, right, we need to perform what I call the identification phase or step, right? We need to figure out there's a lot of verbiage here in front of us, or somebody just spewed out a lot of words in a heated back and forth. We need to figure out, okay, is there actually an argument here? Okay, and that could itself, it seems pretty straightforward, but it's actually a lot more tricky than it seems. She shouldn't have done that, or somebody yells, abortion is wrong, or the death penalty is okay. It doesn't matter how expressive they are or how loud they proclaim their position. Just yelling something like that isn't an argument. As we'll see here shortly, we actually need two different things in order for there to be an argument even there, right? So we need to be able to determine if there is an argument, okay? And then not only that, as we'll see a little bit later in the lecture, we need to be able to tell what kind of argument there is. So in fact, as we'll see here, each of these two basic steps then consists of two sort of sub-steps, if you will, right? Is there an argument present? Is there even an argument here? And then what kind? Let's say, okay, yes, there is an argument. Well, then what kind? Okay. Obviously, if there is no argument, then you just skip the second step, right? So that's what I call the identification phase, okay? Then, so we've identified, yes, we have an argument, okay, and it's, as we'll see here shortly, it's either going to be inductive or deductive. And so then we would need to determine that, okay? It's an argument, and let's say it's deductive. Well, then we get into what I call the assessment phase, okay? And this is where we come in and we say, okay, well, how good is this argument? And as we'll see, this will have two steps as well. The concepts that we employ in that assessment process is going to depend on the type of argument we're dealing with, and more on that later. But as we'll see, we are either going to be assessing the argument's validity and soundness if it's a deductive argument, or the argument's strength and cogency if it's an inductive argument, okay? But either way, regardless of what type of argument it is, there's a two-step process, right? We're going to analyze how well the premises connect to the conclusion. Okay, that's this first fork here, if you will. And then we're also going to go in and analyze the truth of the premises themselves, okay? And this will make much more sense as we go through here, or go throughout the rest of the lecture here. But in general, I just wanted to point out, okay, logic, study of arguments, has two general steps: identification, which then consists of two substeps, right? Is there an argument here, and what kind is it? And then the assessment part, okay? And as we'll go into the assessment part in much more detail when we get into deductive and inductive arguments, okay? But basically, you're going to assess how well the reasons that are given for the conclusion connect to the conclusion. That's this first part. And then also how true, or whether or not the reasons given are in fact true within that argument. Okay, so again, don't worry about this too much. I also meant to, I should have started by pointing these things out, but if any of this seems kind of overwhelming, don't worry too much. Okay, obviously our emphasis is on ethics, not logic. Okay? And logic can be very, very tricky for a lot of people. I always like to bring up learning foreign languages. It didn't matter. That was my weakness. It didn't matter which language it was, and I tried many of them. Didn't matter how much time I seemed to spend trying to study the language. It doesn't click for me. I don't know what it is. And I have a buddy who's the exact opposite. He like learned 8 different languages. Some people, for whatever reason, that's logic for them. So, you know, if it's not your cup of tea, or if it's not making a lot of sense, don't sweat it too much. Okay, we're just going to be dealing with the basics. And I know that it is almost like learning a foreign language with all these new concepts and so on. On the other hand, if you're kind of mathy, you'll see that there's a lot of parallels with logic and how it works and with math. So if you're mathy by nature, a lot of programmers, lawyers, there's a lot of similarity in the way the mind works with logicians. And in fact, if you're going to take the LSAT and you want to go to law school, there's going to be a lot of logic stuff on the LSAT. So, you know, logic, again, very, very helpful, but can also be very tricky. And I just wanted to mention that and address that as well, and be upfront about that it is tricky. I understand that, and I expressed why it was that we're doing any of this, right? But do realize I understand that it is tricky, it's difficult, and don't sweat it too much. After the first part quiz, right, you won't even have to worry about this specific stuff. And then in terms of the quiz, if you're worried about, you know, what do I need to know in terms of logic, there won't be a lot of, you know, specific arguments, or there won't even be, that I can recall, any specific arguments where you have to go in and analyze and do particular stuff. Instead, in terms of the logic on the quiz, you want to know the general stuff. You know, what is logic? You know, as we'll see here in a second, what exactly is an argument? You know, what is this notion of a premise? The general conceptual stuff, okay? So I think that's all I wanted to mention. Difficult subject, not for everyone. On the other hand, like I mentioned, it is interesting to note that there are a lot of synergies, I guess, or however you would put that, where, you know, if you do a lot of programming, then, you know, logic, it's going to probably match up well with your way of thinking, if you will. Anyway, okay, so back to the lecture itself. So let's move on then. We talked about what logic is in general, how it's kind of best thought of, or at least in my opinion, as a 2-step process, and then how there's, you know, 2 minor steps within each of those major steps. So let's talk about, we know we're dealing with arguments. That's the major sort of thing we're dealing with here. Well, what is an argument? Of course, we probably all think we know what an argument is on the face of it, right? But as I intimated a moment ago, it's maybe not as straightforward as we initially think, right? It's basically at least 2 or more claims expressed together that, when taken together, are meant to support a position on an issue, right? So you need at least 2 separate claims, or things that are said or written that can be either true or false, okay? Which are intended, when taken together, to support a position on an issue, okay? So that's a lot there. you know, what does all that mean to unpack it? Really, there's two basic things that are needed, right? A premise, okay, or something that's said or written, right? So an argument can be expressed verbally. It can be, you know, obviously we're going to be reading lots of arguments. Whatever shape or form it takes, you're going to need a premise, at least one premise, maybe 10,000, okay? At least one premise and then a conclusion, okay? So what do we mean by a premise? It's something that's said or written, whatever form the argument's taken, right? That is intended to support or give us reason to think that the conclusion is true, right? Or it's a reason given for us taking the position on the issue, whatever the issue is, right? So, for example, it gets really hot and humid here. You shouldn't move here. Okay. So the premise would be it gets really hot and humid here. Okay. That's the reason given for them taking that position or the conclusion, which is right. Well, the issue is should we move here? And the conclusion would be no, you shouldn't. Right. And so that premise that was given, it gets really hot and humid. That's the reason that's given. Okay. That's what we mean by a premise. You always need a premise given or, you know, expressed in some way, right? In order for there to be an argument. That's why I was suggesting earlier, it doesn't matter how loud somebody shouts, the death penalty is wrong or the death penalty is fine. It doesn't matter how loudly they express that, right? If they don't also give us some reason to think that's correct, that position or that stance on that issue is correct or the one we ought to take, then they haven't provided us an argument. All they've provided us is a position, right? Without any support or without a premise to think it's the correct position. Okay, so strictly speaking, you need these two ingredients. And what's the conclusion? It's just the stance that you're taking on the issue, right? It's what's supported by the premise. So in the example I gave, right, it would be you shouldn't move here. Okay, so that's the conclusion. Again, the issue would be should you move here, right? It's like a question. It's something about which there's a debate. Should you move here? The conclusion, whoever's offering that argument, right, their stance they're suggesting we ought to take is no, you should not move here. And the reason they gave, right, is it's hot and humid. Okay? So they have provided an argument. The conclusion was don't move here, you should not move here. And the reason given was it's hot and humid. Okay? You need those two things. If they had just said, you know, again, it could be really loudly, you shouldn't move here. Not good enough. Okay? They need to give us a reason, okay? At least for us to say correctly, right, that they have an argument, that they've offered us an argument. Okay? Also, in terms of an argument, right, lots of shapes and sizes. You know, in some sense, right, you can have, and I'll give you an example. Actually, right now, let's go ahead and give this example of an argument that's given in one sentence, right? So you can have an argument in one sentence. And on the other hand, you can think of an argument as consisting of an entire book. For example, John Stuart Mill's book, Utilitarianism, in some sense, right? That's one gigantic argument for why we ought to subscribe to utilitarianism. So arguments, again, do come in lots of shapes and sizes. I wanted to emphasize that, make sure that that's coming across there. So let's go through. We have an idea of what an argument is now and the two basic ingredients. Let's go through a quick example here. Bear with me while I get this on the board. In a democracy, the poor have more power than the rich because there are more of them and the will of the majority is supreme or always wins or something like that. Okay, so in here, I apologize for the terrible handwriting there. Hopefully you can read that. In a democracy, the poor have more power than the rich because there are more of them and the will of the majority is supreme. Here in one sentence, we have an argument. And there are things within this sentence which can be taken by themselves and then determined to be true or false. All right, so what I always, when starting off, I always suggest trying to highlight or find the conclusion first, starting with that. And then I think it's easier to kind of work backwards once you find the conclusion and work backwards and then find the premises or the reasons given for that conclusion. So what we're doing here, right? What are we doing here? We're trying to find. We know there's an argument here. I'm saying yes, there's an argument here. Okay, so is there an argument here? Is there something here that looks like a premise and a conclusion? Yes. Okay. What we're trying to do now is highlight, what is the conclusion, and then work backwards and figure out what the premise or premises are. Okay, and so one of the first things I'd mention is we have what are called indicator words. Okay, so when you're doing this business of logic, right, and you're analyzing an argument, and you're trying to figure out, what the conclusion is, you're going to look for certain types of words, and then similarly, when you're trying to find the reasons given or the premises, right, you'll also look for certain types of words. So, for example, what are some conclusion indicators? Therefore, as a result, okay, consequently. Okay, those indicate that a conclusion, at least when you have an argument present, that a conclusion is likely to follow. And then similarly, we have premise indicators, right? And I'll indicate one here, right? Because that tends to signal, hey, or indicate, hey, there's a reason that's about to be stated, right? Or a premise is about to be stated, right? For believing whatever. Because since is another common one. As a result of, okay? Now as a result, comma usually indicates a conclusion might follow, right? But as a result of is sometimes an indicator of a premise. So we know then that the premise is probably going to follow from that. I just want to mention that. Now we don't actually have a conclusion indicator per se in here, but I did want to mention, right, the presence of oftentimes of indicator words, right, which will make this business a whole lot quicker and easier. So hopefully, can you spot the conclusion here? And if we were in the classroom, everybody would be like, well, where is it? Hopefully you notice the conclusion is, look, the poor have more power than the rich, right? That's the stance taken or the position, okay, given here. The poor have more power than the rich, okay? Now, why think that? Okay? And what's the issue, the more general issue? Who has the power in a democracy, okay? And the position or conclusion they're taking is the poor have more power than the rich in a democracy. And I should say all of this is always qualified by this, right, in a democracy. So the conclusion is the poor have more power than the rich, okay? And then what's the premise? Well, again, we have an indicator word right here. So there are more of them. So look, that's a reason to think the poor have more power than the rich because there's more of them. That in itself, even if we weren't given the last part, that in itself, if we were just told in a democracy the poor have more power than the rich because there are more of them, that in itself is an argument, right? We're given a reason for thinking this is true. Okay, it would have been a lot weaker or not near as good of an argument, right? As when you add this. So we're here, we actually are given a second premise or a second reason for thinking this is true, okay? And they say the will of the majority is supreme. So couple those two premises together, and then this becomes a lot better argument, right? Because these two together, if it's true that there's more poor people than rich people in democracy, and if it's true that the will of the majority, or whoever there's more of, is going to reign supreme, well, then it's a lot more convincing, right, that the poor have more power than the rich, okay? So taking these two premises together, that makes it a lot more powerful than argument. But I just wanted to point out that strictly speaking, to have an argument, you really only need one of the two premises, right? It just wouldn't be near as good of an argument. Okay, so hopefully you're sort of getting the hang of, what an argument looks like, how it works, the basic building blocks or ingredients of an argument. Again, what's the fancy logic terms for those? Premise, conclusion. Okay, be familiar with those terms. You always have, at least in an argument, you always need to have the conclusion, okay, which is usually always there, right? Abortion's wrong or the death penalty's wrong. That's the part that's usually always there, right? But to have an argument, you also need to have evidence or reasons to think that's true. That needs to be present in order for there to actually be an argument there. Okay, so having familiarized ourselves a little bit more with the nature of what an argument actually is, let's delve in with a little bit more detail into the different types of arguments. So we know what an argument is, right? Going back to the identification phase, is there an argument here? So we know, hopefully at this point, right, how to determine yes or no to that question, right? Is there an argument here? Yes, because there's at least one premise and a conclusion. or no, because I don't have those two basic building blocks, right? I don't either don't have a premise or I don't have a conclusion. Okay, then the second part, remember, is, well, what kind? And that's where then we'll start talking about the two basic types. And I think for the discussion that follows, maybe I want to do it this way. Let's go like this. So we'll be talking about deductive and inductive. Okay, those are the two basic types. And as we'll see, the difference between the two is actually very, very minimal. And interestingly, one word, right, can make all the difference between whether the argument ought to be taken as inductive or deductive. And if you change that one word, it could make the argument could change from being inductive to deductive or vice versa. And then related to that very point, we'll have also indicator words, just like we had indicator words for conclusions and premises. We'll have indicator words that'll help tell us whether or not the argument's deductive or inductive in nature. So two basic types of arguments. Okay, we're going to start our discussion by talking about deductive arguments. Okay? So we know what an argument is in general. What makes an argument deductive rather than inductive? So all arguments, okay, fall under one of these two categories. All arguments are either deductive or inductive. Okay? And determining which it is, a lot of times will come down to you analyzing the context that you're given. Okay? What it really comes down to, in some sense, is the intent of the person giving the argument. Okay? So in a general sense, I'm going to try to differentiate the two here at the outset before we dive in. Right? What it comes down to is, does the person offering the argument think they have proved the conclusion, right? So given their reasons, they think it's impossible for the conclusion not to be the case, right? They think they've definitively proven the conclusion to be true. Then they've offered a deductive argument. If, on the other hand, they think, hey, given these reasons, this conclusion is a lot more likely to be the case, but not necessarily going to be the case, right? They wouldn't bet the farm, as I like to say. They wouldn't bet the farm that the conclusion is going to be the case. Then that would be inductive, right? So it all boils down to, do they think that their argument, right, the premises they've given, necessitate that the conclusion is true, or do they think that the premises have supported the conclusion, right? Is there that element of necessity? The conclusion has to be the case. I will bet my life the conclusion is true. Or do they just think that they've supported the conclusion, right? They still think that the conclusion is probably going to be the case, right? But the difference is they're not going to bet their life, right? They still recognize, well, it's a lot more likely, but not necessarily going to be the case. Okay. Hopefully, as we go through each of these in more detail now, that'll make a little bit more sense too. Okay. So going back to the deductive arguments, how do we know there's an argument here? How do we figure out if it's deductive? Well, we ask ourselves, does this person who's offering this argument, they might be wrong too, right? They haven't definitively proven that the conclusion is true, right? But is that what they think they're doing? Do they think that given their argument that the conclusion they're offering has to be true? Then they've offered a deductive argument, okay? So the conclusion's not to necessarily follow given the premises, right? The person thinks that, okay? So then, if we have a deductive argument, okay, and we've correctly identified it as deductive, then we want to speak to it, how to assess it, right? So that goes into the second, the phases, right, of logic, right? So we've identified, hey, it's an argument and it's deductive because the person seems to think that the conclusion has to be the case, right? There's no avoiding it. It will necessarily be the case. Okay, so then how do we then assess it? Part two, right? We'll always use, again, two sub-steps, right? Two assessment terms. Okay, we'll always employ two assessment terms. Which two terms you use depends on whether it's a deductive argument or an inductive argument. Okay, don't conflate the two. Don't use validity and soundness when assessing an inductive argument. These two concepts only apply, okay, to a deductive argument. So we know we have an argument, we know it's a deductive argument. So then we want to determine whether it's any good, right? So, by the way, I mentioned earlier there's this, right, similarity between logic and math. Well, even the way a lot of logic is done, right, it's presented almost like a math problem, right? So, for example, right? If we were to try to isolate an argument here, like so that one before, right? The how was it worded? In a democracy, the poor have more power than the rich, blah 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 blah, right? We could have broken it down like this, okay? And the poor have more power than the rich would be the conclusion, and we would put the two premises here, okay? And so what I'm saying here is when you're assessing validity, what you're doing is you're asking whatever reasons are given, right? If we assume that they are true, right? We don't care if they actually are true, and they can be really weird, right? Really obviously false premises, okay? But for the sake of assessing the validity of a deductive argument, we assume the premises are true, and then we say, if we assume those premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true? Okay? If the answer is yes, right, assuming the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true, then that's a valid deductive argument. Okay? If it's possible to assume that the premises are true and the conclusion can still be false, right? So these premises don't actually, their truth doesn't necessitate the truth of the conclusion, then it's invalid. Okay, every deductive argument it's an on-off, right? It's either valid or it's invalid. It's either the case that the premises necessitate the conclusion, or it's not the case, right? The truth of the conclusion, or it's not the case. Okay, so again, what we're doing when we assess the validity of a deductive argument is we're analyzing how well connected the reasons given are to the position the person's taking, right? And we're saying, okay, assuming these premises are true, does this conclusion have to be the case? If the answer is yes, again, it doesn't matter how ridiculous the premises actually are. If when you assume they're true, the conclusion has to be true, then that's a valid argument. Okay? And that, for a lot of rookies, you guys are all rookies unless you've had experience with logic, it can be really weird. A lot of valid arguments, it seems strange to a lot of rookies to call them valid because of how gnarly or weird the premises are and how straightforwardly false the premises are. Again, it doesn't matter whether the premises are in fact true or false when you're assessing the validity of the deductive argument, right? You're assuming they're true, and then you're asking yourself, if I assume they're true, does this have to be true? If that answer is yes, then it's valid. If you can assume these are true and this can still be false, then it's invalid. And you're just going to have to, that's what validity is. And you're going to kind of have to commit that to memory. Hopefully it makes sense. Now the soundness, okay, so that's step one, okay, when you're analyzing a deductive argument, right? You're asking yourself, okay, how well do these reasons the person's given actually connect to the conclusion? Okay, how well do they actually support the conclusion? Remember, with the deductive argument, the person giving the deductive argument thinks the conclusion has to be true, right? That's the very nature of a deductive argument. So, right, it makes sense to say it's an invalid argument if when we assume the premises are true, the conclusion can still be false, right? Well, that seems invalid, even on the face of things, right? So that's why we say it's invalid. Again, it's valid if assuming these are true, this has to be true, and then it would be valid. So soundness, this is why I have a lot of corny ways of expressing things, but I like to say it's like going above and beyond the call of validity, right? Because it has two boxes you have to check off in order to call the deductive argument sound. So again, every deductive argument, every one of them, is either going to be sound or unsound, or you could say not sound, okay? One or the other, it's a light switch. It's either on or off. It's either sound or unsound, okay? Well, what makes the deductive argument sound? Two things have to be the case, okay? One, it has to be valid, okay? That's why I said above and beyond the call of validity, because at the very least, it has to be valid. So if you know the deductive argument's invalid, you can assume the premises are true and the conclusion can still be false, then you automatically know it's unsound, okay? Because for the deductive argument to be sound, it needs to be valid and something else, right? So if it's not valid, you automatically know it's unsound. All invalid deductive arguments are unsound, okay? Commit to memory. And so again, it has to be valid. So assuming the premises are true, the conclusion will have to be true, right? And then, see, this is where we're interested in the truth of the actual premises, right? This is where we go in. Okay, the second part is all premises. All, that's important too, must be true. Okay, all it takes is one. Okay, the more premises you have, the easier it is to render the argument unsound. All it takes is one premise to be false, and the entire argument is rendered unsound. Okay, so all premises must be true. So it has to be valid, and then all the premises, you go in. This is where you actually care about the truth of the premises, right? Is it in fact true that blah, 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 and blah, 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 okay? Now, assuming you've gone in there and you've analyzed it, and you say, okay, yeah, then and only then is the argument sound, okay? Now, usually, especially in philosophy, right, it's pretty clear whether the argument's valid or invalid, where a lot of the debate is, it's on whether or not all the premises are in fact true or not, okay? And look, a lot of times, strictly speaking, maybe you're in a position where you can't tell if it's unsound or sound because you don't know, at least definitively, whether all the premises or at least some of the premises are true or false. Then, strictly speaking, you can't speak to whether it's sound or unsound. But if you might not know the truth or falsity of all the premises, but if you know, on the other hand, that at least one of the premises is false, that's all you need, right? And you could say, nope, hey, all the premises are not true, therefore it's not sound. It'd be unsound, right? But I just want to point out there that, look, a lot of times you don't necessarily know whether or not the argument's sound or unsound. To be able to say that definitively, you would have to be able to know whether each of the premises is in fact true or false, right? To be able to say, yes, it's sound, you need to be able to say that all these premises are in fact true, right? Now, what's interesting about a sound deductive argument, what should you be telling yourself? You ought to be betting the farm on the conclusion of a sound argument, a sound deductive argument. Why? Because what you've said is, hey, it's valid. If I assume the premises are all true, right, then the conclusion has to be true. And then you've also said, right, because you said it's sound, that all the premises are in fact true. Well, then the conclusion has to be true, right? Because you said it was valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And then by saying that it's sound, you said all the premises are true. Well, then the conclusion also has to be true. Okay, you bet the farm on the conclusion of a sound deductive argument. Okay, so hopefully that's starting to make a little bit of sense. I've given you a few of the arguments to kind of work through at the end. Instead of the typical reflection time questions at the end of the lecture, I've given some arguments for you to work through. And we'll go through here, one here in a second. I'm not actually, I don't think, going to write up all this example argument that I've given, but I'll read it, and hopefully maybe you're following along as well, because I want to leave this up here so that we can keep that contrast between inductive and deductive visible here. But so again, we know what an argument is. We know how to identify it as a deductive argument. Okay, and then we've talked about, right, the assessment terms. Okay, validity and soundness. Again, you're only employing those when you have a deductive argument. Okay, so let's go through real quick that example before we turn our attention to inductive arguments. Go through our example of a deductive argument. Maybe I'll just hold this up here actually. So it reads, I don't know if I can read this backwards. All persons who eat a pound of arsenic will die within 24 hours. Premise 1. Michael Vick's, you're not supposed to see this yet. Michael Vick's great uncle ate a pound of arsenic at 11 o'clock last night. So the conclusion is Michael Vick's great uncle will be dead by 11 p.m. tonight. Okay. So again, premise, all persons who eat a pound of arsenic will die within 24 hours. Okay. Premise 2, Michael Vick's great uncle, poor Michael Vick's great uncle. Been using the same example for like 15 years. I don't even know if he has a great uncle that's still alive, but Michael Vick's great uncle, at least according to this argument, ate a pound of arsenic at 11 o'clock last night. Okay. Now, is this deductive argument valid or invalid? Is it true, given those premises, that that conclusion will follow? Michael Vick's great uncle will be dead by 11 o'clock tonight. So if we assume those premises are true, remember what we're asking ourselves when we assess the validity of a deductive argument. Assuming those premises are true, does the conclusion then have to be true? So if we assume these premises are true, then yes, the conclusion would be true, right? It would seem like the conclusion would have to be true. Now, this is where it gets a little weird, right? Because Michael Vick's great uncle didn't eat a pound of arsenic at 11 o'clock last night, at least not to my knowledge, right? So while the argument's valid, okay, assuming those premises are true, that conclusion would have to be true. In fact, at least one, and I'm assuming the first premise is probably true, all persons who eat a pound of arsenic will die within 24 hours. Okay, but at least one of the premises was in fact not true, right? The second one, Michael Vick's great uncle ate a pound of arsenic at 11 o'clock last night. That's not true. And remember, all you need is for one of the premises to be false. Right? So then that renders the whole argument unsound. So even though this was a valid deductive argument, and even though the first premise, at least seemingly, is true, okay, the second premise is false, rendering the entire deductive argument unsound. Okay? So hopefully that helps kind of work through an argument like that. Let's go ahead and turn our attention to an inductive argument. Okay? Here, again, the only difference, right, is whether or not the person that's offering the argument thinks the conclusion has to be the case. Okay? And I meant to point out, go back to this deductive argument. Notice the indicator word, all. That does not allow for exceptions. Okay? So we have indicator words. I mentioned that before. All, none. That also doesn't allow for an exception, right? Kind of the opposite way. 100%, 0%, right? These are terms or expressions that are indicative of a deductive argument because they're not allowing for any exceptions, right? 100% of the time this happens, or none of the time, 0% of the time this happens, right? So those are going to be indicative of deductive arguments. Whereas, right, if we get most, many, sometimes, right, or percentage-wise, right, 99.9999%. Look, that is not deductive. That is, albeit very small, right, it's acknowledging that there could be an exception, right? It doesn't happen 100% of the time, okay? It's not necessitating a conclusion, okay? 99.99% of the time, yada, 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 that's not a deductive argument, okay? You're allowing for an exception, okay? Or, 1%, that's still inductive, right? It's not deductive. Okay, deductive arguments, all, none, 100% of the time, none of the time, okay? They're not allowing for any exceptions. And then conversely, when you have an inductive argument, you're going to see most of the time, a lot of the time, you're not going to see these all-inclusive expressions. So going back, I think I mentioned this earlier, this term right here, all, makes all the difference here. If we were to change that to most or many, or however it would correctly read here, that would change the entire argument from deductive to inductive, right? Because it's now allowing for an exception. And I mentioned earlier that, hey, a lot of times, the fact of the matter is, the person's not necessarily in front of you, right? When we're reading John Stuart Mill, we can't say, hey, dude, did you mean for this to absolutely follow, right, your conclusion, or did you just mean that it would probably be the case? No, we can't ask him, right? So you're going to have to do the best you can and just work with the context, okay? And I would say most of the time it's pretty clear, whether the person thought, the conclusion has to be the case given what they're saying, or whether they think they're just supporting it. But it can be tricky sometimes, and I just wanted to point that out, that you have to go on context a lot of the times. Okay, so all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. Classic example of a deductive argument. Okay, those premises, the person's going to bet the farm. They're going to bet their life that, assuming those premises are true, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. They're going to bet their life, bet the farm that Socrates is mortal, right? Given how the structure of the argument. Okay, and again, all men are mortal, right? The way that is expressed, it's not allowing for exceptions, right? The conclusion is going to have to be the case. Versus, take something said that's like this. There's a strong south wind today. It's probably going to rain tomorrow. Somebody that says something like that. And I know nothing about farming or, statistical correlations between, wind strength and precipitation. But, let's say that, a farmer told us that. He's not going to bet the farm that it's going to rain tomorrow. Okay? Even though there's a strong likelihood, given his experience and statistical correlation, a lot of times in the past, when there's a strong south wind, there's rain tomorrow, right? But even given that strong argument, right, it's still only inductive. He realizes that, hey, it might not still rain tomorrow, right? Even though it's oftentimes happened in the past, right? 95% of the time when there's a wind from the south at 20 miles per hour or more, right, it rains the next day. There's still that 5% or 10% or whatever of the time when it doesn't. Okay, so that's an example. Hopefully you're starting to kind of sense the difference here. That's an example of what we call an inductive argument, right? They're not going to bet the farm that the conclusion has to be the case, even though it's very likely. And in fact, I guess, depending on how strong the inductive argument is, maybe they would bet the farm, right? And it might still be a good bet. But the point is, they know that the conclusion doesn't have to be the case. It's not a 100% bet, let's put it that way, right? Okay, so that's really the difference, the defining feature. So the conclusion in an inductive argument is thought to be the case, but not necessarily, right? So the conclusion is thought to be supported by the premises, but not necessarily proven, right? But not proven. Again, look, the person offering the inductive argument thinks they're, supporting the conclusion, usually thinks they're giving a good argument, right? That we should believe the conclusion is going to be the case. But again, they don't think that it absolutely has to be the case, even given their strong reasons. Okay, that's the defining difference. Okay, and then so when we're assessing it, right? So we know argument here, and now we know with this example for let's say it's inductive, right? We know it's an argument and it's inductive. Well, now we need to say something about its assessment, right? Whether or not it's any good, in other words. And so again, that's a two-step process, but this time we're using, I literally erased that and put the exact same thing there. Go figure. We're using different conceptual terms though, right? Here we're using strength, and then we're using the term cogency. Again, these two are the conceptual terms, assessment terms you would use when assessing an inductive argument. Don't use these when talking about deductive arguments. It doesn't make sense to say there's a strong deductive argument or a cogent deductive argument. Same thing, right? Don't say that you have a valid inductive argument. Don't conflate these, okay? But having said that, what you're doing is very, very similar. Okay, so what are we doing when we analyze? Let's erase this for the time being over here. What are we doing when we ask ourselves about the strength of an inductive argument? Well, again, we have an argument here. Let's just say, again, that there's two premises. We want to know, just like we did with the validity of a deductive argument, we're asking ourselves the same thing when we're assessing the strength of an inductive argument. We want to know how well these connect to the conclusion. Okay? And an inductive argument then we will say is either strong or it's weak, or you might say not strong or something like that. Strong or not strong, strong or weak. Okay, it's one or the other. Okay. So how do you do that? How do you determine whether this is strong or weak? You ask yourself, if I assume these premises are true, these reasons given are true. Again, you don't actually care at this point whether the reasons or premises really are true. Assuming they're true, does this conclusion, right? Does it have to be true? That would be a deductive argument, right? But is it much more likely to be true? Assuming these premises are true, does that make the conclusion much more likely to be true? If that's the case, then you would say strong inductive argument. Okay. And again, that can be a little weird or funky for rookies because you can get some inductive arguments with just ludicrous. In fact, the example I'll give you here in a moment, just ridiculous premises that are clearly false. But it can still be a strong argument from a logician's perspective, right? Because when you're analyzing the strength of an inductive argument, you don't care about whether the premises are actually true. You're analyzing the connection between those premises, right? Provided they were true, how well would they support the conclusion? Okay. How well is this connection? Forget whether these are in fact true. Okay, so if when we assume these are true, this is much more likely to be true, then it's strong. If when we assume the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't seem that much more likely to be true, then it would be weak. Okay. Now, for the conclusion to be cogent, again, very similar to what we did when assessing the soundness of a deductive argument. We have two check boxes. First, it has to be strong, right? So you might say, like I did earlier, it's going above and beyond the call of strength this time, right? So if it's not strong, right, assuming the premises are true, the conclusion is a lot more likely to be true. If that's not the case, right, it's weak, it's a weak argument to begin with, then it's not a cogent argument, okay? But if it is strong, well, in addition, right, so again, strong, assuming the premises are true, the conclusion is much more likely to be true. In addition, now we're going in, just like we did when assessing the soundness of a deductive argument, we're going in and assessing whether, in fact, all the premises are true. Okay, so again, all inductive arguments are either going to be cogent or not cogent. You get the idea there, and it's just not cogent. Okay, so what makes it cogent? It has to be strong. If it's not, so again, if it's not strong, if it's a weak inductive argument, right away you know it's not cogent. Okay, so to be cogent, it's got to be strong. Assuming those premises are true, the conclusion is a lot more likely to be true, and all the premises have to be true. Okay. So if even one, all it takes is one, if even one of the premises is false, the whole argument then, even though it might have been strong, is still not cogent. Okay? The only time you would say the whole argument's cogent, right, this is a cogent inductive argument, is if it's strong and all the premises are true. Okay, let's go through a quick example here. So, let me see, I'll just bend this. There we go. Sorry about this, guys. Most people named Brad have over $17 million. Come on, right? Crazy. Premise 2, your instructor's name is Brad. Not so crazy. Conclusion, your instructor probably has over 17, whoops, you're not supposed to see that. Your instructor probably has over $17 million. Okay, is this argument strong? This is where it can seem a little weird, right, for rookies, okay? This is a strong argument. Even though premise 1 is clearly false, unfortunately, for me, right? It's still a strong argument because if you assume the premises are true, which is what you're doing when you assess the strength of the inductive argument, if you assume the premises are true, then that conclusion is a lot more likely to be true. Okay? So it is strong, but then is it cogent? Well, this is where you would go in then and say, hey, red flag right here. Most people named Brad have over $17 million. Unfortunately, let's see how not true, right? Unfortunately not true, thus rendering the argument not cogent. Okay, so hopefully you can start to make out the difference, right? Know what an argument is in the first place, and you're sort of sensing the difference between a deductive and inductive argument. Again, not a lot of difference, right? Notice the indicator word here. I meant to point this out. Most. Okay. It changes to all. Boom. That makes a world of difference here, right? Now, probably typically indicates an inductive argument as well. But see those words there, just tweak a couple words, tweak a word or two here, and that can make all the difference between whether or not that argument, right? You're going off the context, whether or not that argument should be rendered inductive or deductive. Okay. So know what an argument is, know the two basic types, and what makes the difference between those two basic types. Okay. Real quick here, let's see if I'm done with this. Yeah. Real quick, I wanted to talk about a special kind of inductive argument that you probably heard of, and it's so common, especially in philosophy, that that's why I wanted to take the time to mention it here. It's called an argument by analogy. And again, this is a type of inductive argument, okay? And the way this works, right, is it's pointing out, basically, as the premises are, it's basically pointing out, hey, look, there's all these similarities between these two things. And then based on those known similarities, they want to suggest that there's going to be this other thing that's true of both those things. So let me give you an example real quick. Let's say that we have two sisters, Susie and Sally, and we know, right, that, let's say, they both like the color blue. They both like scary movies. They both like math. Okay, and the idea is, hey, look. So says the person offering the argument by analogy. Hey, look. There's this cool class called logic, and we know Susie likes it. And look how similar, right? All these they have so many other similarities. The odds are, right, that Sally is going to like logic as well. So see how that works? So the premise would be something like, premise 1 might be like pointing out all the other similarities, right? They share all these similarities. So this will say something like share these similarities, right? Sorry about that terrible handwriting, guys. I might as well not even write anything there at this point. Share these similarities, right? So you're saying something like, you're rattling off all the similarities. And then premise 2 would be something like, hey, look, Susie, so premise 1 would be Susie and Sally both like blue, the color blue, the scary movies, math class. And then premise 2 would be, hey, look, Susie also likes, we know Susie likes logic. So they have all these other similarities. Whatever Susie likes, Sally seems to like. We know Susie likes logic. premise 2. So the conclusion then is the person offering this, right, wants you to suggest, right, wants to suggest, hey, it's probably the case that Sally likes logic. Okay. So premise 1, look at all these similarities. Premise 2, we know Susie likes logic, and based on those, right, all those known similarities and the fact that Susie also likes logic, they want us to conclude, hey, it's probably going to be a good idea, or a good likelihood, I should say, that Sally's also going to like logic. Okay, now they're not going to bet the farm necessarily, right? Depends on, I guess, how many similarities are known. But you know, the idea is, hey, it's pretty strong chance, okay, that this is going to be the case. Now, these are notorious, right? They're very common for a reason because, you know, I don't want to say they're wishy-washy, but I mean, you could rattle off 9 million similarities, but how relevant to this feature, right, are they? So there's a lot of different ways to attack the analogy, right, to render somebody's argument by analogy, you know, no good from a logical perspective, right? You could say, well, look, none of the similarities you rattled off have anything to do with this other particular feature that you're trying to suggest is similar, right, between the two. Or you might point out a contrary analog. This is where it gets kind of interesting, right? So what we call, again, a contrary analog. So let's say there's Samantha. So a contrary analog is one for whom, or it would be, right, an example of someone or something for whom all these are also true, but then we know that this is not true, right? So obviously the more contrary analogs that someone could provide, the less convincing the argument by analogy is, right? Because you're saying, hey, look, it doesn't matter that we have all these similarities. We have examples, right, that the person still won't like this, okay, even though this person does. Okay, so contrary analogs then are produced by the person that's trying to undermine the argument by analogy. And so there's a lot of different ways, right? Again, you can point out that none of the similarities rattled off are at all relevant. You can point out contrary analogs. Okay, but again, just be familiar with the idea of an argument by analogy. You probably heard of that expression, or argument from analogy. You're just pointing out that, you know, certain similarities make then this other thing that we know is true of one person, for example, that it's going to probably be likely then that it's true of the second person, for example. Okay, and I meant to mention there's one super famous, and maybe even, you know, a lot of you guys have heard of it, argument by analogy that was put forth by William Paley. When was this? Back at the end of the 18th century. Very famous, especially in philosophical circles, obviously, but, you know, even outside of philosophical circles, for the existence of God. So, you know, it's this the famous watch analogy, right? So he says the complex functionality of a watch, right, suggests that it must have had an intelligent designer, right? Because a watch doesn't just come like that, right? It has to be intelligently created, right? So there's this intelligence or complex functionality in the watch, right? Then that suggests, again, that there must have been an intelligent designer that created it. And so then premise 2 is, hey, look, the universe is similarly complex. And so what's Paley want us to conclude? Well, then it must have also had an intelligent designer. And of course, I'm simplifying that to a great extent, right? And it's much more you know, nuanced than that, but that's the general gist of the argument. And so I just wanted to give you, you know, a real life argument by analogy, you know, the one that's been offered, a famous one in the history of philosophy, at least. Okay, the last thing, again, we're not going to do too much in logic, right? If you actually find yourself digging this kind of stuff, you know, the more mathy stuff in the logic, you know, we do offer entire classes in logic. You know, not just intro to logic. I mentioned in the first video, right, that there are higher level classes in logic. So if you find yourself liking this sort of thing, I mean, you can take intro to logic, which I also teach. I mean, I think this stuff is very applicable to our everyday lives. It's very helpful to, you know, analyze things in this logical manner, I feel like, anyway. But if you feel like you like it, it's always the other intro to logic class, and you know, higher level logic classes as well, where you go really in depth and, you know, start doing like symbolic logic and seeing all these funky letters and so on. And it really does look like math at that point. Yeah, you see these symbolic letters and numbers and all kinds of weird stuff at that point. But I just wanted to point out, yeah, that you know, logic is something that you can spend a lot more time on, but we're just dabbling with the basics. And so we're not going to spend really any more time on anything other than I wanted to point out what are called fallacies. Okay. And these are basically, you probably have a general sense of what a fallacy is coming into the course, right? It's basically mistaken reasoning. So when you're dealing with arguments, obviously if you find a fallacy within the argument, that's going to flag, it's going to be a bad thing, right? Typically fallacies are unintentional, but not always, especially in political season. Man, if you watch the commercials, they've gotten really bad, in my opinion, right? I can't stand how personal they've gotten, but on the flip side, it's really fun to teach logic, and especially fallacies during the political season, because you can see all sorts of, for example, ad hominem fallacies, come up in these advertisements, and then in the debates as well. When they're debating with one another, the fallacies are plentiful, and not always. I would suggest some of the things going on are not always unintentional either. But what is a fallacy again? It's typically a mistake, right? It's a mistake in reasoning, okay, where you're not doing, at least from a logical perspective, what's proper. Okay, so there's some sort of mistake going on. When an argument's involved, it's typically going to flag it as being a bad argument. Okay, so there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of fallacies. To the point where it's aggravating because different logicians will reference, the same fallacy by different terms. There's so many, in fact, that the logic textbook from which I teach, the inside cover has a top 10. There's so many that there's a top 10, the most common fallacies. We're just going to go through what I would say are the 3 of the most common types of fallacies, especially in philosophy when you're reading through, a lot of these texts that you will be reading for the rest of the semester, some of the things you might come across. So know what a fallacy is in general, and then we'll just go through a few of the different types. So we have what are called ad hominem fallacies. This is a Latin term that literally translates as attacking the man. So the way this works, right, instead of criticizing or critiquing, the argument given, the person instead attacks the character of the person giving the argument. And from a logical perspective, that's no good, because what we're concerned with is the merit of the arguments, not the person or character delivering the argument. So don't listen to what Joe Blow has to say about the death penalty. He's an alcoholic father. Hey, it's not good to be an alcoholic father. Those are definitely character flaws. But that's a mistake to suggest, that his character flaws, Joe Blow's character flaws, have anything to do with the merits of his arguments against the death penalty. He might have terrible character flaws. He might, in fact, be a horrific alcoholic father, but he might have written, nonetheless, some of the most outstanding arguments in defense of the death penalty or against the death penalty we've ever seen, right? So from a logician's perspective, right, you kind of are cold and calculating, right? You remove yourself from considerations of feelings and character, right? That, whether or not he's an alcoholic father does not give you any license to dismiss what he says from a logical perspective. You still have to analyze the merit of the arguments themselves, in and of themselves, okay, for what they are. And to do otherwise is to commit the fallacy of an ad hominem, right? You're attacking the person instead of the actual argument. Okay, another example would be a straw man fallacy. You might have heard of this. You probably heard of maybe even this one. That's an ad hominem. You hear that a lot. Well, maybe now it makes a little more sense. So what's a straw man? What this is, right, is it's a mistake in the sense that the person committing the mistake misrepresents the actual argument put forth by someone else. So it's a straw man in the sense it's not the real thing, right? And they typically, and again, sometimes this is intentional, right? They do it in extreme fashion because it's a lot easier to knock it down then, right? So let me give you an example. Don't vote for Joe Blow. He's for legalizing everything. If we didn't know any better, and that's all we knew about Joe Blow's platform, because he's running for whatever position, right? And we're voters. If we didn't know any better, and that's all we heard, legalizing everything, anarchy, well, lo and behold, come to find out Joe Blow's actual position was just for legalizing marijuana or prostitution or gambling, right? It wasn't for legalizing everything or letting everything go. It was just for, permitting a few things. That's a lot different, right? And so it would have been a straw man, right? When the person suggesting that Joe Blow was actually for legalizing everything, no, that's a misrepresentation of Joe Blow's actual position. If in fact what he was really for was legalizing marijuana or just legalizing gambling or something like that. Okay, that's a straw man fallacy. And again, probably a term you've heard of before. Maybe makes a little bit more sense now. And then finally, we have what is called a false dilemma. Okay. And the way this works is it's a mistake in the sense that the person committing the mistake suggests that there are only two options, right? Hence dilemma, right? That there are only two options when in fact there are 3 or 4 or 7 or 19,000, right? The point is that they're not acknowledging at least one or more other perfectly viable options. So it's a false dilemma. They're suggesting there's only these two options when in reality or when in fact there is at least one other one. Okay, so look, either we keep the status quo or we legalize everything. Well, that's a false dilemma, right? I mean, why not just legalize gambling or legalize prostitution or legalize marijuana? Those 3 things, for example. We don't have to legalize everything, right? There's all kinds of intermediate options, and to suggest otherwise, right? To suggest that there's only these 2 extreme, positions, right? Either keep the status quo or legalize everything. That's obviously a mistake, right? That's a false dilemma. Okay, so just a few examples of, again, what I would say are some of the more common fallacies. No doubt you probably maybe even heard of all 3 of these. Okay, I wanted to conclude by just mentioning, and these are kind of suggestive of how you will apply what we've talked about to all the readings henceforth. Suggest some questions then that you should always have in the back of your mind as you're doing these readings going forward. These are logic speak or logical questions, right, that you would have. What is the author, right? So starting for the next lecture when we talk about Thomas Hobbes and his moral conventionalism, what is the author trying to convince me of, right? So what is Hobbes suggesting, right? What's his position, in a very general sense on morality, right? These are the kinds of questions you should have in the back of your mind. And logic speak, that would be like asking, what is his conclusion? So in a very general sense, what position or conclusion does he reach on morality? Okay. What reasons does the author offer in support of that position, right? So what reasons does Hobbes give for whatever stance he takes on morality? This would be equivalent to, in logic speak, right, to what we call premises. Okay, what premises are advanced? Third question, assuming these reasons are true, right, provided these reasons Hobbes gives us are in fact true, does that conclusion, right, his ultimate position on morality, does that have to then be the case? So if it's true that this is what we're like in the state of nature and that yada, 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 then is it really ultimately true that we ought to take the moral conventionalist stance on morality, right? So how well, assuming those premises are true, do they actually connect then to that conclusion, that ultimate stance or position? And then finally, right, so that would have been, right, that third question is like applying, logically, like asking, the question of validity, applying validity to the argument that Hobbes gives us, right, or applying that concept of validity, right, assuming those reasons, things he says about the state of nature and so on and so forth, assuming all that stuff's true, how well, right, does that connect to the position of moral conventionalism, right? How well does it support his conclusion or his ultimate stance, right? And if it does, right, all those things, if we assume what he says is true, right, if it does seem to necessitate his conclusion or his stance on morality, then what he's saying seems to be valid, right, from a logical perspective, right? We'd say it's valid, or if it's inductive in nature, we'd say it's strong, right? But we're assessing that connection between the premises and the conclusion. And then finally, right, the fourth logical question, we're concerned with the truth of the premises, right? Are they in fact true? This would be like applying the concept of cogency if we're dealing with inductive arguments, right? Or soundness if we're dealing with deductive arguments. Okay? Are the reasons in fact true that Hobbes gives us, for example? Whatever reasons that are offered for the argument or for the conclusion being true, right? Are those reasons in fact true? Is it true that this is what we'd act like in the state of nature? Is it true that that we really are this self-interested and evil by nature? Is it really this gloomy and dreary? Those are the kinds of things that you should have, right? There's a reason why we went through this stuff, talked about this, all this stuff on logic, right? And so I want you to have these questions again in the back of your mind as you're going through and doing these subsequent readings. So there's something I've been wanting to say, and I can't remember what it was. This is the upshot of having a terrible memory. All along the second half of this video, this lecture, there's something there, and I just can't remember what it was. I think I covered all the major bases. If I think about it, and it's important enough, I'll mention it in the next video. But otherwise, I think that's it. Again, nothing too sophisticated or fancy here. I know that it is brand new for a lot of you guys. Again, I like learning a foreign language, so don't stress out about it too much. So what I've offered for the reflection time questions, right, are just a bunch of examples. So what I would say, this is a little bit different than the typical reflection time questions. Rather than, offer a robust response to just one question, given the way these are, right, and what I'm asking you to do, right, and that's just identify whether they're deductive or inductive, and then assess them accordingly. There's not really a lot of opinion giving, right? It's just, is it deductive, inductive, and then is it sound and valid if it's deductive, and so on, right? Since there's not a lot of writing here, I think, instead what you can do is just answer all four of them and just, straightforward. You don't have to give a, reasoned explanation as to why you think it's valid. It's valid because the reasons necessitate, right? The premises necessitate the conclusion. There's nothing to explain there. So this is the one, what I'm getting at is this is the one exception. You don't have to, pick one question and give a robust response to it like you normally would, right? Go ahead and go through all four of them. Do the best you can. Identify whether they're each deductive or inductive. And then if it's deductive, say whether it's, valid or invalid and whether it's sound or unsound. And if it's inductive, say whether it's strong or weak and whether it's cogent or not cogent. Right? Otherwise, I think that's it. Again, feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Don't sweat this stuff too much. Think general. We won't be doing anything like this. Okay? I think it's good to try to apply what we've been talking about to specific arguments and examples. That's why I do this. But on the quiz, you won't have to do anything specific arguments like this. Instead, it'll be the general concepts. What is validity, that sort of thing. Okay. Otherwise, moving forward, right? The next lecture we'll actually dive into our first theory. Okay, you'll have your first substantial reading. Thomas Hobbes, an older, kind of. I always suggest it's sort of easier, but then I learned my lesson. Right? I say always. I used to do that, but then I learned my lesson because I talk about how it's going to get much more dense and difficult as we progress throughout the course. And I think that's true, but on the other hand, I don't mean to diminish the difficulty of Hobbes. What I'm getting at here is that it's written in Old English and it can be very tricky. So I do realize that. And I will say, you might have to spend a couple times reading through some of these long sentences, long paragraphs. But I do think that what he's saying underneath it is pretty straightforward. And I think it might be one of the more helpful lectures in the sense that I kind of, unpack a lot of those trickier sentences and what should be said in a lot clearer way, I think. Because underneath it, I think, like I said, it's actually pretty straightforward what he's saying. Now, whether or not what he's saying is true, right, and whether or not we ought to be subscribing to what he's saying, well, that's up to you to decide, right? And now, hopefully, you feel like you're better equipped with some logical tools. So that's it. Look forward to the next lecture. Thanks.